everyone. Today we're talking about rape and revenge fantasy.
Way to keep it light again, Kathy Barrett.
It is a horror episode, though, so we are talking about it in the media.
Yeah, we are. And I mean, listen, I think with Women's History Month and all that good stuff,
I know.
We, it's a subgenre that has evolved.
It is. And near the end, we'll talk about some really good movies that you could watch if you're interested in working out this shadowy part of our culture.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting if you type in revenge fantasy because they'll pull up revenge fantasies also with men because there are those, right?
Yes, of
course. The ones that we're going to be talking about more specifically today are the ones that are central to the female character. And they're different because there's a different struggle. So I'm going to be referencing and talking about a woman by the name of Carol J. Clover, who many of you, if you're big horror fans, know her name. And she is the author of a book called Men, Women, and Chainsaws. And she is also the woman who coined the term final girl.
Yeah.
So we can thank her for a lot of the psychoanalytics of the horror genre, which it's funny when you look her up. I have to say my favorite is watching all of these guys on YouTube mansplaining this book and admitting to not understanding the psychoanalytic approach. Some of them felt that literally used the word lost, and it was, but it was quite amusing.
That's honest.
Yeah. But it was fun. It was just ironic because there was a lot of mansplaining. I didn't see any women talking about this book. I only saw men. And that's a bad thing, but I just thought it was, good for you guys for at least, I don't know, taking a chance at something you didn't fully understand.
Absolutely. And it sounds like we need to get online and start talking about this.
Yeah, we do. So I thought that was interesting. So here's a quote from her. "The image of the distressed female, most likely to linger in memory, is the image of the one who did not die, the survivor, the final girl." So Clover's book is geared to film scholars and combines film theory with psychoanalytic and gender theory by folks such as Judith Butler. So she's another person who's contributed to this. And, Shannon can talk more about this, but Clover's use of psychoanalytic theory and psychodynamic theory is really, really interesting. It's every reason why you and I really started this podcast, which is there is so much psychology in horror. And especially if we're looking at this from a binary place, especially between the genders in horror.
Absolutely.
So I thought this was a really interesting topic to dive into. So Clover used slashers, possession films, and the concept of revenge to discuss her theories. That's really what she looked at. And these were not only prevalent subgenres in the 1970s and 80s, but these were also the platforms in which women were subjugated in film. Women in horror has really profoundly evolved since that time. And it wasn't until the development of the final girl that we started to see some of this revenge. Because if we look back at, the torture porn of the 1970s, these women didn't really stand a prayer some of the exceptions might have been Black Christmas, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. She makes it out of there. Or does she?
Yeah, we don't know.
Right? Clover starts to look at this evolution. So Horror Film Theory 101, Carol J. Clover's original theory of the final girl, unpacking Clover's 1992 book, Men, Women, and Chainsaws, Gender in the Modern Horror Film. So that was an article that I read. So a couple of the resources, that would be one, Men, Women, and Chainsaws, the book that I've read and went back and highlighted for this episode. But I'm going to start with a little bit longer quote from Clover, so you can see how her psychoanalytics play into the way that she really unpacks this. So she says, "The tale is no less one of maleness. If the experience of childhood is perhaps ideally enacted in female form, the breaking away requires the assumption of the phallus. The helpless child is gendered feminine. The autonomous adult is gendered masculine. The passage from childhood to adult entails a shift from feminine to masculine. It is the male killer's tragedy that his incipient femininity is not reversed, but completed through castration. and the final girl's victory that her incipient masculinity is not thwarted but realized in phallicization. Clover goes on to discuss how Brian De Palma's belief that female frailty is a predicate of this genre. He proposes that, in effect, that the lack of phallus is simply horrifying, at least in the mind of the male audience. So I think this is important because when we think about the development of the horror film, we know that it was primarily made for the male audience. So when we think of things that would scare a man from an unconscious place, it would be the absence of his penis and losing it.
Yeah, of course.
My
Not so unconsciously.
No. I'll tell you, my male dog, he's always making sure his is still there.
Yeah.
He's always checking in.
Giving it some attention.
He'll go pee and then I said, yeah, honey, it's still there. It's still there.
It's like when we trip and then we look at the sidewalk menacingly as if we need to check that there's something there that
was there
that grabbed us.
Yeah.
It's like that.
Well, and
you're still there right there, buddy. Still there.
And I think this is a metaphor for even the way men and women are in the world, in the privilege of not having to pay attention to as many external things, because to them, their security lies in their ability to reproduce and to control the species. And so like even the characters that are built in horror, it really is around this like toxically masculine, not that, being scared to lose your penis makes you toxically masculine, but it's really focused on this one piece of anatomy, where for women, it's about surviving in other ways. Right. And so and Clover goes also on to talk about how much of the character development in women in horror, when they are the perpetrators instead of the victims, is around witchcraft and pregnancy and all this. So it's very primitive.
Where women have the biological power type of deal.
Yes. And again, the threat to man, right? So
we are inherently threatening to each other as genders.
That's right. Absolutely. So just in very, very different ways, but I totally agree with that. So the revenge fantasy offers a double standard because the abject terror on the part of the male is a rare expression and objectively satisfying to the female gender. So in other words, like what Shannon was just saying, is the revenge fantasy takes away that threat. It gives us a revisionistic tale or revisionist tale of us actually being the ones who are more physically capable and powerful. And also we use a lot of intellect to outsmart them, right, in these situations. So
I imagine that comes out of like a long history of being physically not as strong, physically not. So we had to develop the idea that we have to manipulate
100%
instead of being physically more proud.
And also how we were socialized. So if you think, and I've explained this in just theory when talking to my students about when we look at different personality traits of men and women and how socialized, like because women were socialized to not be physically aggressive and to go out into the in recess and beat up, the other boy on the playground. They were taught to be ladies and hold it all in. So what does that produce? Gossip,
and
right?
Repressed anger. And
then what we do is our weapon is to talk because we're not allowed to act out.
Well,
on those
because
things.
our weapons are in relationships.
Yeah. That's right.
Because we're socialized to have relationships.
And we're socialized to act a certain way and to repress anger. So there lies like this different way that we've also been, not only, I would argue that it's purely biological. I would say a lot of it is social because women can be physically aggressive and that's
of course
normal. So yeah, okay. Author Kaylee Donaldson, in a 2020 article titled Promising Young Woman and the History of the Rape Revenge Fantasy. So the 1970s saw the dual rise of two major forces, second wave feminism and the exploitation genre. So together they made the deeply divisive rape revenge fantasy a familiar feature of horror movies. One of the things that I remember the most about watching horror when I was younger, so it was more terrifying, but also the movies made in the 70s and 80s were way more, they were raw. they didn't allude to things, they just showed you.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of torment and torture in ways that they now just don't do as much of that.
I believe a lot of that came out of the fact that there were a lot of politics going on.
Yes.
And there were, I think the rape revenge fantasy movie genre, etc., also came out of that idea that there were a lot of sexual politics like on fire in the 70s.
100%.
And this was one way our media was like burning its own bra or whatever.
For sure. Because women started to fight back. So Clover wanted to know why slashers consistently featured a female protagonist when the target audience at the time was predominantly male. So Clover began to look at how being androgynous as a key feature of the final girl. So this was linked to sexual naivete, asexuality, or even anxiety about having a sexuality. It was also linked to character names, voices, and what kind of jobs they had. So if you look at Laurie Strode's character in Halloween being one of the first final girls that at least that we recognize, and she was very shy about her sexuality, and she liked a boy. They would kind of tease her and she'd be like, that's enough, I just kind of want to go to the day. But She didn't, it's not that she appeared asexual, but that wasn't, she was book smart. She was doing other things. She wasn't the girl dying because she was having sex with her boyfriend and not paying attention.
Right.
And if we look at Giallo, which we've talked about on this show before, many of the heroic characters ended up being queer and not being manipulated by the male sex. So they would come in and sometimes save the heterosexual woman who was overtaken and charmed by this violent man. The lesbians coming in going, yeah, don't fucking buy into that shit. I'm going to take him out for you. So this builds over time. So the final girl, one thing the final girl also is that we don't get with some of these other female characters, she's observant. She's paying attention to her surroundings. She's not thrown off by these little things. She's smart and also could even be deemed paranoid. Right? Like, why are you so worried? Why are you so anxious? Chill out. Have a drink. Smoke a joint. They're pretty straight edge.
There's usually one character doing that to the final girl.
Always. So, which is in opposition to the aloof, sexual, impulsive adolescence we see in the girls who are tortured, raped, and killed in slashers. So, unlike the females, although males die in slasher films, their deaths are often quick. Males are often quick, less humiliating, and torturous, with less terror-inducing pursuits. So when men die in slashers, it's like their head gets chopped off.
Yeah.
A woman has to go through like hours. But I would say that is also changing. So when we watch things like Saw.
I would like to just get decapitated, please. Thank you.
Like, no, these guys now in modern horror are going through some of this.
The men are being tortured too.
They're being tortured.
It's a very short movie if everyone just gets their head chopped off.
It was so fast. It's 30 seconds. It's a short.
We don't get to enact a lot of our fantasy if that's the way everyone dies.
Right. So revenge fantasies often use the final girl, but they are a subcategory of the horror genre derived through a feminist lens. So revenge drives the protagonist, who is being tortured, to the tormentor, right? So you flip roles.
Yeah.
And it taps into the collective anger of women's victimization and the years that they were silent. So that is what the revenge film is there for.
Right.
Yeah.
Would you like to do a little thing we like to call...
Clover Facts with Carol. Facts about Carol J. Clover.
It's always the same.
I know.
The song is hilarious.
Because it's the part of the show. I have to keep it consistent.
I know. I like it.
Number 1. Carol J. Clover is an American professor in what area of studies?
Okay. Horrifying.
Yes. Number 2, unlike women in slashers, Clover noted a different pattern to male deaths. How did she describe men dying in slashers?
Interesting.
Number 3, Clover identifies how the final girl is a metaphor for what?
What? Why?
Number 4, the inspiration for this revenge film was inspired by a real-life criminal case, where an online predator was lured and captured by a group of vigilantes. And number 5, this movie sends a pregnant serial killer on a dark odyssey.
Oh, God. Thank you for that. At the end of the show, Kathy will give us the answers. Well, I'll try to guess.
That's correct.
And then Kathy will tell me how I was wrong.
So one of the things that we have noticed about revenge fantasies, I would say more so in the last 5+ years, is that the interesting thing about these characters, the female characters, is that the protagonist can actually be an outright sociopath with an axe to grind, or they can be the girl next door who has had enough. So they can still be bad-ish characters, but oftentimes their badness comes from trauma. Right? So maybe the development of a sociopath because of something that has happened to them, which is different from like some of these perpetrators and slashers who are just like mindless killers. Right? There's usually a story. So for the viewer, it's a fantasy that most people will never live out, which also is a kind of a fun way of getting that need.
Yeah.
Right?
Because not all of us are currently capable of that kind of revenge fantasy, and also people will be prohibited from doing that because they'll have an innate sense of not wanting to go to jail, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly.
Et cetera.
So it's kind of nice to be able to watch something and be like, oh, fuck yeah, you got it. Yeah. So like, what's the need? What's the need for it? So one, we get to side with and imagine being the one executing the revenge.
Yes.
Without consequence.
Yes.
And repercussions of our mental and physical well-being.
Yes.
Revenge fantasies also tap into our primal human desire, the shadow side that Shannon often talks about, the part of us that craves balance and equality. So I've had clients before say, this is not like me to be this angry at something. And I'm like, well, let's unpack that.
Yeah.
Because it's a part of all of us. And it's a healthy part of all of us. Because if we don't acknowledge it, that's a problem. So it's this eye for an eye, right? That, like we were just talking about a moment ago, there's consequences to actually carrying it out, but imagining it or being able to vicariously go through it with a character can be really therapeutic. And I would say with marginalized folks, women being one group, feeling that justice is never served.
Right.
So in a lot of these cases, we've talked about this in other episodes, true crime episodes, rapists barely get sentenced if they're even caught or even found guilty.
So awful.
And it's awful. And so trauma experts such as Judith Herman, her work is amazing. If you really want a good lesson in psychology and complex post-traumatic stress and intergenerational trauma, Judith Herman is just she's such a solid researcher. And, she discusses the way in which these injustices affect mental health. And she has a new book out called Truth and Repair. In a sense, it is a revenge fantasy, an emotional journey of folks who were victims of the Me Too movement. She has some male, I believe she interviews some men as well, because men were also affected by that. Obviously, primarily women and trans women, but everybody was affected by that. And her radical approach begins by listening to survivors and asking them what would truly make things right for them. So it's gives them an opportunity to sort of play out, without doing it, playing out what they really, really, really like. If you think about that narrative approach to therapy of this retelling that would include this person really suffering their perpetrator. So by recounting these stories, she offers an alternative version of justice, one that focuses on healing for survivors and their communities.
This can be so empowering.
Oh my gosh.
For otherwise regulated, mentally healthy women.
Yes.
So I want to give that caveat, but this can be so healthy for that, because our ability to fantasize about anger is compromised in our culture in general, and not acceptable. And I just have so many, specifically women, but also men, honestly, that were acculturated in a particular way, that when they start to have these kinds of fantasies, there's so much shame. There's so much misunderstanding and why their psyche is like, quote unquote, doing this to them type of thing. And it's like, if we can talk about that and we can have therapists that are educated in a way to know that you don't want to stall them from doing that. You don't want to be in any way judgmental or redirect them away from those kinds of things. And if we can, if you can actually have therapists who are comfortable in the moment talking about very difficult things and listening to somebody talk about their fantasies of hurting and enacting revenge on people who have really harmed them, and are adept enough to know the difference between that and a psychopath who's fantasizing about enacting a crime.
Yeah.
You have to have that adeptness. You have to know the difference. You have to know your client. You have to know where it's coming from. That's why I say like otherwise mentally healthy, because obviously we've talked in several true crime episodes about like
misplaced anger and
sociopaths and pedophiles, you know, fantasizing and how we would interrupt that and all that. This is different. So don't try really hard. I know it seems strange, but like they're very different things.
No, I thank you for pointing that out, because it's true. I mean, what I find is someone who really struggles with processing that anger, that's a first cue too, because a lot of people are very uncomfortable in that feeling.
Oh yeah. Oh yes.
The ones that are like, this is fun thinking about this, and
you
blah,
can
blah,
tell.
blah. You can
you
just
have to read behavior.
Yeah.
You have to read behavior for a living, and you have to be able to see that there's a sadistic pleasure in one thing, and a hesitancy, fear, and uncomfortableness, but also a drive to get it out.
Yes.
In another.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for that distinction. Dr. Herman's. They talk about how she has a compassionately told insight that challenges us to reimagine justice and create a more compassionate world for survivors, which I think when we think about survivors of sexual assault, of rape, of whatever you want to frame that, there tends to be a lot of injustice there. So I'm very much, this is on my like must read list, and I've heard wonderful things about it.
Good.
So the revenge fantasy comes from the lack of faith in the justice system, the inequality and disparity between the sexes, and how victims tend to carry the burden of proof, which I see all the time in my work. So for me, I people are like, how do you go to court and why do you do what you do? I said, it's the ultimate revenge fantasy.
Absolutely.
Are you kidding me? I get to go in and completely reframe what the perpetrators have tried to do. I get to go in and go, let me tell you why this is backwards. And so I describe my work as an ongoing revenge fantasy. And it feels very good.
I'm glad. And you're doing some good.
And I'm doing some good. I hope so. Yeah. So the revenge fantasy offers viewers this, though. Let's go back to watching movies. So the intrigue of revenge fantasies, who is prone to them, what role they play, and how to effectively heal. This is an article by Dr. Michelle Maidenberg. So the first one she talks about is it gives us a sense of empowerment. So a reimagining of situations that do not often end in justice. Maybe justice happens if we take matters into our own hands.
Yes.
In the real world, that's kind of scary to think about, but watching it, like, you know, I talked about on last recent episode, I was talking about the series Fool Me Once. That's what she does. She takes it all in her, and she's such a cool character to follow. And you're like,
I've heard that's good.
Maya, fuck, let's go.
I've heard that's a good series.
Yeah, it's good. And so that's what it is. It's a revenge fantasy. Number 2, it balances the scales. So according to Hein and Weber, children, another vulnerable population, use revenge fantasies to disavow their inability to act and mourn and disguise their feelings of shame. Because of their developmental and physical limitations and inevitable feelings of lack of control, children can assert themselves through their powerful and assertive thoughts and feelings. Number 3 would be embitterment. Fantasies of revenge provide an outlet for our rage. 4, cinematic catharsis. It just really feels good to watch sometimes.
Yep.
Number 5, we witness characters overcoming adversity, which is always cool, exacting vengeance, and restoring a sense of order. Their triumph becomes ours, providing emotional release. So and Shannon and I talk about this a lot. When there is a character building in a film, when there's deep development that you care about these people and you attach to them, it makes the revenge fantasy even better.
Yes.
Because we feel like we're on their backs, like fighting with them.
Well, and you're going through your heroine's journey while you're watching it, because the first chunk of a revenge movie, of course, is going through the crime that was committed to you all over again.
That's right.
So you have to be able to withstand that, and
Yep.
you work your way through that, because you go on the same emotional arc that you've been going on, except for you're enacting how it could resolve for you metaphorically, imaginally.
Totally.
It's hard.
Yeah,
It's hard to do. It's not exactly easy, but
No. And then the last one, number 6, taboo and forgiveness. Different cultures view revenge differently. Some uphold the principle of retributive functional symmetry, where injustice is repaid with similar injustice. In contrast, modern Western thought encourages forgiveness over revenge. So,
yeah,
yeah.
we can get there.
So the last thing I'll talk about before we go to our answers is a little bit of the neuroscience. This is an article published January 26, 2022. It's called Revenge, the Neuroscience of Why It Feels Good in the Moment, but may be a bad idea in the long run.
Yeah, just watch the movie. Don't actually do the thing.
So what does our brain do? So most of us have dreamt about revenge at some point in our lives and perhaps even achieved it. But is it ultimately a good idea? Will it actually make us wiser and happier in the long term? This happens when people go through loss. You know, there's this, will it change the loss? Will it change the level of grief if you go and do something that could end up hurting you more or hurting society more? So, you know, that idea of revenge is sweet, and there is evidence from, but there's evidence from neuroscience that, you know, they're right. In a 2004 study published in Science, researchers scanned participants' brains using PET scans while they played an economic game which centered on trust and sometimes led to vengeful actions. So when trust was violated, participants reported that they wanted revenge, and this was reflected in an increased activity in the reward-related regions of the brain, the dorsal striatum. And revenge, in other words, is all about feeling good rather than feeling bad. So it's someone coming out of a situation where they're feeling nothing but bad, that idea of revenge can flip that switch. They also found that those participants with the strongest activity in this region were willing to incur greater personal costs. In this specific study, it was losing money to get their revenge. So here's the dilemma. This isn't necessarily the case after the act of revenge. So the thought, the dopamine, the area in the dorsal striatum, the leading up to, and what they're even willing to say they would sacrifice lights up. But what happens after they act on it? In 2008 study, researchers found that people often reported far more negative mood immediately after engaging in an act of revenge. Their conclusion was that participants reported a mix of emotions. Revenge is not always sweet. Rather, revenge is bittersweet. Hardly as punchy as a phrase. This means that revenge actually has the capacity to trigger both positive and negative emotions, including tension and uncertainty and having a sense of dread. This, in many senses, is the dilemma of revenge. So revenge seems so appealing. It appears rewarding. The thought of it is exciting. The reward center of our brains just light up. They positively glow. In the planning phase, it feels wonderful, but afterwards it's a different story. So the longer term effect depends on so many other factors, including how your feelings change about the original act. We know our memory and timing to an event and time away from it changes the way we assign emotions to that event. We know this about trauma. So whether you can now empathize with the perpetrator, understand it from their point of view, how you feel about the personality of the perpetrator, and whether they can repair their behavior without you having to exact revenge. Sometimes we see this in criminal cases where the person who has, like, a sibling or a family member has died, and they get up there and they confront the perpetrator, and they'll say, you know, I forgive you. And that's obviously more of to let it go for them.
Yep.
but also recognizing that continuing to feed that revenge fantasy is actually going to result in more negativity.
Yeah, it just hurts you.
It just hurts you. So it doesn't mean that no one's telling you to forgive the perpetrator, but that act of forgiveness is really for the survivor or the survivor of that family or family member of the survivor. So even time itself can affect how the revenge feels. And this makes it hard to work out whether there are any longer term psychological benefits. So at the end of the day, what the research says is we can't really predict. We know that there's some, correlations to things, but what we assume is that it's not going to feel the way you expect it to feel.
No.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Would you like me to list some movies, or would you like to go over the results of the Clover test?
Let's do some movies.
Okay. So here's just a list. I put 2 of Shannon's. Well, I know one's a favorite. Another one she's spoke on that she said she liked, but I'll do those 2 at the end. I have on here Promising Young Woman, which is a great movie.
Really great.
The original, and I would even go as far as saying the remake of I Spit on Your Grave.
Yeah, I mean, I the original is the one I think I'm familiar with, and
yeah,
that's a great one. I mean, it's fucking brutal.
It's brutal. And so is this next one, Hard Candy.
Yeah.
Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. The original, the Swedish with my girl, Numi.
That's a great flick.
It is, and talk about a great revenge scene.
Absolutely.
2017, the movie Revenge, I thought was a fun one.
That's one of my top 5.
Yeah. Carrie.
Top 5.
And then the other 2 that Shannon has talked about a lot, and she'll be talking more about in a upcoming episode, is the movie Audition.
Mm-hmm.
And then, one of her favorites, and it is a good one. And then Piggy.
Oh yeah. That, oh God.
So those are some on my list. There are many, many more, but those are some that stand out to me.
Yeah, the one I would add just right off the cuff is top 5 for me is American Mary.
Okay.
From
I think I remember that one. I think yeah. Okay.
Just like top revenge movies would probably be American
we've watched
Mary.
That on Discord.
Revenge. That movie MFA was really good. And Kill Bill is also
Kill Bill's on the list. Yeah,
is also a fun, 4 million hours of all of that.
It's a fun one. For sure.
There's a lot of really good ones out there. It is absolutely a subgenre of horror that is hit or miss because some of them can be just so. Most of the ones we've mentioned there are just hard to watch. But that's because you're working through your own material there.
That's right.
And the ones that I really end up liking are the ones that don't concentrate so much on me, like relating and reliving horrible things. We have to do that at the beginning. That's act 1 of any revenge movie, is the thing that happened to the person. But that more take us on a journey of that feeling of revenge and have that imaginal quality of it feeling better than it actually does in real life.
And there's the catharsis. It's like, let's just sit back and pretend this actually works.
Yeah.
So
great. So now we definitely need some answers to the
Clover Facts with Kale. Number 1.
Clover Facts with Kath. Like, what are we doing?
We're doing Clover Facts with Kath.
I understand.
Carol J. Clover is an American professor in what area of studies?
I don't know.
Medieval.
Okay.
Early Northern Europe.
I knew it was going to be something wackadoodle.
Yeah.
Something that wasn't related to this at all.
Yeah, she's not, this is the only thing she's done in horror. She's not historically,
No.
Yeah. Unlike women in slashers, Clover noted a different pattern to male deaths. How did she describe men dying in slashers?
Quickly.
Yep, by surprise, quickly, and at times entirely off screen.
I was listening to you for the last half an hour.
I really appreciate that.
Okay.
Number 3, Clover identifies how the final girl is a metaphor for what?
Female empowerment?
Yes, but also the pleasure and pain of gender fluidity. Because there is a reward and a cost
to everything
for a woman to not just be feminine.
Absolutely.
Yep. Socially. There's
Oh
a
my
social
God.
consequence.
For real.
Not a real consequence.
Just like there's cost to men being
gender fluidity in general.
any gender fluidity in any of us.
That rigidity in society.
Well, and that's what the generation Alpha
I know. I praise them
is
for that.
fighting for.
Like, let us just be. Let it be. The Beatles said it a long time ago.
They knew things.
It was about gender fluidity, that song.
It is now.
It is. I just made it that way.
Okay.
Number 4, the inspiration for this revenge film was inspired by a real-life criminal case where an online predator was lured and captured by a group of vigilantes.
There's so many of those right now.
Yeah.
But
it's one on the list.
Okay.
It's Hard Candy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, which
There
is
you
interesting
go.
because there was only one in this one.
Yeah.
And then number 5, this movie sends a pregnant serial killer on a dark odyssey. I don't know why this is not on my list because I actually really liked this movie.
This one I really not ringing a bell.
It's Prevenge.
Oh yeah,
it's
you
the
love that movie.
And again, there's only certain. I think it's because the pregnancy part was so funny in this. It wasn't this serious, like she's pregnant and giving birth to Satan. It was more like her pregnancy and her hormones threw her into like the baby was like, you have to kill, you have to kill, you have to kill.
There was more of a like ludicrous.
It was hilarious.
There was more of like a ridiculousness to that.
Yeah.
Which could go very awry, right?
It worked.
But it worked in that one. It was a good one. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Appreciate you. Appreciate all of you listening to this joyful topic. We tried to make it have some light spots. You know,
If you haven't read her book,
please do.
It's a good one to just have, even if you don't read it all at once, because it's heavy text.
Yeah, no, for sure.
I read it in parts.
And it's each chapter, as I remember, is specific to a movie.
Yeah.
So watch the movie, then read the chapter. Like it's not a binge book.
It is
It's not one of those delightful. It's,
I think
it's
I still
more
have
edification.
I think I still have like 40 pages of it left.
There you go. It's definitely more edification. And then Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman is a really good book. If you're
That is one of I use that one to teach.
that's where I learned about it in my master's program a million years ago. So
Such a good book.
it's a great book. And thank you so much for listening. We very much appreciate you. This has been an episode of Terror Talk. My name is Shannon.
And I'm Kathy. Sleep safe, everyone.